Nostalgia can be a powerful tool, but used incorrectly, it can make a game feel derivative and uninspired. There's a fine line between an engaging callback versus repetitive gameplay design. Tears of the Kingdom did an excellent job at using nostalgia and classic ideas from the traditional Zelda blueprint by making a game that blends the open world ideology of Breath of the Wild with the puzzle based and environmentally focused dungeon design seen in classic linear Zelda games. Certain areas in Tears of the Kingdom use those ideas and modify them to work with its open-ended approach to gameplay. It's most widely used in relation to the dungeons and the lead up to them. So today we're going to take a look into dungeons and just how they use traditional influence to capture the feeling of classic Zelda games. But before we begin, make sure you seek out that subscribe button like Princess Zelda and turn notifications on for even more Tears of the Kingdom content. Stormwind Arc does an incredible job with its build-up sequence and atmosphere, and while it could be closely associated with the sand ship from Skyward Sword, the music and boss are what really give this dungeon its classic feel. The ambient nature of music in Breath of the Wild was a huge detour from traditional Zelda games, so to have this section slowly build up and raise tension as you ascend higher to Stormwind Arc gave this area a unique theme that stood out compared to most other areas in the game. But the boss fight with Colgera is where the old school influence really begins to become apparent. Colgera takes its design directly from the Wind Waker bosses Molgera and Goma, and the boss music playing during the fight reflects them. Similar motifs to Molgera's theme can be heard in the main melody, and it's impossible to ignore the thunderous Dragonroost Island theme. This theme grounds the fight with Wind Waker inspiration, which amplifies the connection with the Rito, who first made their appearance in that game. It's a subtle but powerful reference, used to tie this game back to Wind Waker. The theme is well crafted enough that it stands on its own for those who have never played Wind Waker, thanks to the Dragonroost melody being used as Rito Village's theme. But the power and impact that it has for people who have played Wind Waker make this one of the most loved pieces of music in this game. The use of nostalgia is a great example of utilizing past ideas without making this fight rely heavily on them. Colgera itself is familiar enough both in its design and name that fans will recognize it, but the gameplay and combat has its own uniqueness. The musical references and boss design in this dungeon give it an identity, but doesn't make it feel imitative. Rather, it gives you a nice little Easter egg to say Tears of the Kingdom is very conscious of the lineage of games that came before it. Very few places in Tears of the Kingdom's Hyrule feel like they were plucked directly out of a classic Zelda, and the area that I think personifies that and the inspiration for this video is the ancient Zora Waterworks. The ancient Zora Waterworks, more than most areas in this game, really hammers home that feel of old school water temples. Zelda water temples are iconic and have an aesthetic all their own, so when I first entered the ancient Waterworks, it immediately felt familiar in all the right ways. From the music and the architecture to the water-based puzzles, this small chamber did an incredible job at presenting traditional Zelda elements in a contained environment. This isn't even the actual dungeon, and I feel like it did a better job at feeling Zelda than the Great Wellspring of Hyrule. I do feel like the water temple gets a bad rep, as I do still enjoy it, even though it's my least favorite of the four, and I think it's heavily tied to how much I love the whole vibe of the ancient Waterworks. While it's not Lake Hylia, entering this area through a whirlpool in East Reservoir Lake takes huge inspiration from previous water temples like the Lakebed Temple in Twilight Princess. Being able to kinda go underwater into this cavern was a really cool moment because many of us wanted that underwater exploration from older Zeldas to make a return. It's not a perfect replacement obviously, but we don't get many places to go underwater in this game, making the instances that we do feel really unique and special. The main puzzle of this area revolves around raising and lowering water levels and traversing through an ancient plumbing system. Like most of the puzzles in this game, it's not a complex and multi-layered challenge, a likely result caused by the gameplay design of the hand abilities. But I don't think it needs to be complicated. The area feels secret enough that restricting access to the deeper layers with overly complicated puzzles would have possibly bogged this part of the game down. If this were the actual dungeon, then yes, absolutely, give us those crazy, rage-inducing water temple puzzles that we all clamor for. But as a lead-up section to build up the climb to the actual temple, it strikes a great balance of puzzle-based exploration and classic Zelda dungeon aesthetic. I really wish this was the water temple we got instead of the Wellspring Island, but for what it did give us, it became a standout section of the game and one of my most beloved areas to explore. The Fire Temple still, in my opinion, replicates the feeling of a classic dungeon the best. The isolated location makes it feel a lot more closed off compared to other temples. The main puzzle of the Fire Temple revolves around using minecarts and changing the tracks. The intrinsic nature of these tracks means that you will use them repeatedly to traverse this dungeon. While you can completely cheese this dungeon and bypass most of its puzzles with enough stamina and the arm abilities, the Fire Temple's use of backtracking with the rails and carts is very different compared to the more open, exploratory design of the other temples. This temple requires you to retrace your steps more so than most of the others and causes it to feel more confined due to that. Backtracking is traditionally a necessary step in most Zelda dungeons, so with a game that focuses more on open design, having one of the dungeons revolve around an area that is more reliant on you venturing back the way you came gives this dungeon that classic feel. The overall feel of the Fire Temple is extremely reminiscent of classic Zelda, but what parts are directly influenced from previous games? You could point to Skyward Sword's brief railcart ride as a connection, or maybe the spinner tracks from the Arbiter's Grounds in Twilight Princess. Skyward Swords is a bit obvious as they're both minecarts, but the spinner surprisingly makes a lot of sense to me. Thematically, they are different, but the functionality and gameplay mechanic is there. They are both used to traverse areas on set paths that you can't access through normal means. But there's another mechanic in this dungeon I haven't talked about yet that is an exact copy from both Wind Waker and Skyward Sword. I'm of course referring to the lava puzzles. The Fire Temple utilizes the hydrant Zonai device to create land platforms by pouring water onto flowing lava, giving Link an additional means of covering distance. This mechanic was a large part of Dragon Roost Island in Wind Waker and the Fire Sanctuary in Skyward Sword. Both games required you to take either jars of water or water-filled plants to create platforms to explore the dungeons. It's not the focal point or primary mechanic in this dungeon, but it is one that was cleverly used to show off the capabilities of the hydrant, as well as a nice reference to past titles that veteran Zelda players would have noticed immediately. The boss for the Fire Temple might be the largest and most obvious callback though. There's few other enemies that are as classic and infamous as Goma, so what better way to inject an old school Zelda feel than to reintroduce one of these staple bosses in the franchise with Marbled Goma. This version of Goma is extremely different compared to the rest of the franchise. Goma is traditionally depicted as a giant spider or other arachnid, and while Marbled Goma does have a vague spider-like appearance, it is easily the most different iteration of the enemy. Mechanically, it does still revolve around damaging the eye, which is probably the most traditional Zelda thing you can think of. Despite being a slightly varied version of a stone talus in this game, it did make me very happy to see Goma return, even if it is in name alone. The Lightning Temple has some of the best aesthetics in Tears of the Kingdom, and having a spooky, Gibdo-ridden crypt to crawl through obviously has huge connections to Arbiter's Grounds. But there's one more area that is even more heavily inspired by Twilight Princess's best dungeon. The ancient prison ruins is technically a cave, but this underground labyrinth screams classic Zelda dungeon. Arbiter's Grounds in Twilight Princess was the prison where the worst of the worst in Hyrule were sentenced. So to have a direct callback in Tears with the ancient prison ruins does a lot to tie it back to Twilight Princess. Layout-wise, this cave has you traverse through corridors of prison cells and dilapidated hallways to reach a shrine. The ruins are an excellent example of reintroducing old lore while presenting it in a new way that still feels inspired by the dungeon it's based on. This section is pretty straightforward with the statues guiding you, but regardless of its simplicity, it captures the same vibe that you would see in a dungeon like Arbiter's Grounds. The Lightning Temple itself also uses staple Zelda mechanics to establish its identity. One of the most iconic gimmicks from The Legend of Zelda is the use of the mirror shield to reflect light to solve puzzles or defeat enemies. That mechanic returns with the Zonai Mirror. The Zonai Mirror is the main item and puzzle mechanic in the Lightning Temple. Much like in classic Zelda titles, you are tasked with adjusting the trajectory of the light beams to shine light on a specific spot. You can even make your own de facto mirror shield to get the full classic effect by fusing the Zonai Mirror to your shield. The same combat element the mirror shield offers in classic Zelda games is also utilized in the final fight against Queen Gibdo. Beams of light shine down in the boss chamber and allow you to damage the Gibdos swarming you. Shining light on these enemies weakens them and gives Link an advantage in combat. This exact mechanic is used in a lot of boss fights in the Zelda series, like the fights against Kuome and ToTK in Ocarina of Time, and Jahala, the boss of the Earth Temple in Wind Waker. Tears of the Kingdom is a game that takes heavy inspiration from the titles before it, but uses them in a way that doesn't feel forced. But there's classic Zelda influence everywhere in this game. There's music that feels like it belongs in Majora's Mask. The boss fight with the Seas construct reminds me a lot of the mini-boss encounter with the robot pirate Servo from Skyward Sword. Traditional story tropes like the sages return as well. There's a lot of classic Zelda design in this game, even though it still lives and dies with the open world philosophy Breath of the Wild introduced. People love to say, oh, it's a good game, it's just not a good Zelda game. And in Tears of the Kingdom's case, it's a damn good Zelda game. The presentation is different, but the magic that makes Zelda games so timeless is ever present in Tears of the Kingdom. It's that traditional Zelda blueprint reimagined for the modern open direction that allows Tears of the Kingdom to capture the feeling of classic Zelda games. But you tell me, what is it about Tears of the Kingdom that reminds you of the Zelda games before it? Let me know in those comments down below. That of course will bring us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching as always, and make sure that you're subscribed for more Zelda content. Link to my socials are in the description below. Feel free to come over and join the Discord to talk directly with me in the community. That's going to do it for this one. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you in the next one.